We are back. Welcome back to Left Reckoning. David Griscom, Matt Leck. Joining us, I believe maybe the first returning guest of Left Reckoning, actually, now that I think about it. And it couldn't go to a more knowledgeable guest, Austin Gonzales of Machete Mate podcast, one of my favorites for the topics that we're going to be discussing this evening. Austin, welcome back.
Happy to be back and very honored to be your first repeat guest. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
No, we're thrilled. We're thrilled to have you, especially such a jet set guest. Austin's going to talk to us a little bit about these DSA delegations to both Peru and Venezuela. I just wanted to note that I don't have my props with me right now, that Left Reckoning is still very much firmly a pencils out podcast.
Oh, yes.
We were all very excited, and I'm still very inspired by Pedro Castillo's victory, though as we've been watching, unfortunately, there's still a lot of question marks about it. The results of the election are not in question at all, but the fervor of the right wing and whether or not the Western imperial powers are going to play ball with the Peruvian right wing is very much a large question. Could you talk about Keiko Fujimori's sort of refusal to accept Pedro Castillo's election results?
Absolutely. So a little bit of background here. As you mentioned, I went to Peru to observe their elections on behalf of the Democratic Socialists of America, right? I'm a member of both the National Political Committee of DSA as well as their international committee. That was kind of like the basis for our delegation. And we worked in collaboration with a couple other groups that do this regularly, including the Progressive International, as well as the Party of the European Left, and a couple other ones. Sao Paulo Forum was there as well. A couple different groups that do election observing. We met with a lot of different groups down there, and the common theme from groups that we would meet with, human rights orgs, political parties, social movements, the common theme was a fear that regardless of whether or not Castillo would win, that the right wing would try to steal this election in a few different ways, one of which is manifesting itself as we speak, as you've referenced. The two biggest concerns that election observers had, and not just us, but once again, human rights organizations on the ground that we talked to, was one, we feared a situation like what happened in Bolivia in 2019 for their coup, which is to say that Peru, much like Bolivia, has rural communities that lean heavily toward Pedro Castillo in this case, Evo in Bolivia's case, but rural communities whose votes come in later, right? So there was a concern that the urban vote would come in first. And because the urban vote would come in first, Keiko would just declare victory. Now, luckily that did not happen. But for anybody who was sitting on pins and needles on election day, it was very tight. And the urban vote did come in first. And it was, once again, people were a little worried that something like that would happen. The second concern is the one that is manifesting itself right now, which is that the margin would be so razor thin, which we all knew it was going to be very, very tight, but that the margin would be so razor thin that Keiko and the right wing would do what they're doing right now, which is attempt to death by 1,000 cuts, right? Muddy up the process, attempt to scrutinize as many votes as possible. Find very similar to Donald Trump and Stop the Steal, right? Try and find instances of maybe bureaucratic incompetence, right? And say, this is systemic fraud. You see, they cheated us. Even though this is, once again, any example, they've not given any examples of systematic fraud. That's the bottom line. They've not given any actual examples of Peru Libre, once again, which it boggles my mind how they would somehow rig the election, even though the right wing's in power in Peru. But that's a whole other conversation entirely, I suppose. But this is a very real fear. And this is a very real concern from the activists on the ground in Peru that they're going to stop Castillo from getting inaugurated. Now, I don't know, asking my opinion, right? I don't know that they'll successfully be able to coup him before he takes office. But it's terrifying that we even have to have this conversation, right? And as soon as we left Peru, our friends on the ground, the unions we met with, the activist groups we met with, were giving us alarm bells almost immediately, saying, hey, this is very concerning, right? And this is despite the OAS putting out a statement saying, hey, these elections were clean, let's chill out, Keiko, blah, blah, blah. This is despite that. They've still, the media in Peru is so deeply right-wing, they've been in lockstep with Keiko the whole time. So for our comrades on the ground in Peru, all they see is the Peruvian media saying, oh, yeah, you see fraud. Oh, my goodness, this guy Castillo. Whereas there's an interesting dynamic where that the international community just kind of sees, once again, these OAS reports or what the U.S. State Department put out, which have mostly been like, oh, we should respect the results. In Peru, completely different. And that's why people are very afraid that there might be some sort of preemptive coup to stop Castillo. Like I said, maybe I'm optimistic. I don't know. I think I want to. It's like I said, it scares me that I'm even this uncertain because of, once again, how tight the vote margin is. But I mean, we'll see. This is a developing story fully.
Well, for sure, I will say, one thing that does give me a little bit of confidence is just because papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times already have like a grammar and a logic to report on this. Basically, they're saying, oh, he's doing a Trump. They've immediately taken a posture against Keiko, which is, very beneficial. I'm very happy to see. And
sorry, real quick, this is the should I say benefit, right, of having your opposition be led by a literal political criminal, right?
Yeah.
Keiko was literally in prison just last year. She was on house arrest in Lima and could barely campaign. So that's another dynamic entirely. In fact, a lot of the average Peruvians we spoke to, they would talk about the corruption, right? They would say, I'm supporting Castillo because we do not want to, the Fujimorismo, right? That's a legacy of corruption in Peru.
Yeah, you mentioned on Machete Mate that the negative partisanship angle was very pronounced in Lima, especially. Like it was anti Fujimori and anti Castillo. Can you just speak to that a little bit and how it differs from the actual outside Lima?
100% negative campaigning was now, to be clear, I spent all my time in Lima, so all I saw was the negative campaigning. I wish I could have gone to the rural communities where it was a very different dynamic, right? Like you just look at the vote in cities like Ayacucho, which are in the rural areas, 80% for Pedro Castillo. My God, that's an insane margin. But yes, as you mentioned in Lima, it's funny. As soon as I landed in Lima, there were two hilarious things that I saw almost immediately. The first hilarious thing that I saw immediately, as soon as we got off the plane, you know how at the airport you'll see people holding up signs for, oh, I'm your chauffeur for whatever. There was literally somebody with a sign that said OAS, right? OAS. So that was just hilarious to see. Oh, great. The OAS is on the scene to steal the election. That's fun. Although, luckily that did not happen. But the second thing that was super hilarious that we saw almost immediately, the first political billboard we saw, which it said, it was big, bold letters, 5 days to vote no to communism, right?
Wow.
And that was Keiko's campaign, totally negative, which is this is a senderista, the shining path of the communists. We need to stop them. This is unacceptable, right? And as you referenced, Matt, and as I referenced a little bit earlier, the people we talked to in Lima, and the average people, right? Not the political parties. Obviously, the political parties had a much more, I suppose, robust reason for supporting Castillo. The average people, right? We made it a mission to talk to our cab drivers, right? Who are you voting for? There's a really big election coming up, right? You got to have some sort of opinions. Every single one of them, except for one, said, I'm supporting Castillo, and the reason is because of the corruption, right? Because of the corruption of people like Keiko Fujimori. That message, that campaign slogan, no más pobres en un país rico, right? No more poverty in a rich country, that resonated. And it's true. We talk on Machete Mate, my podcast, all the time about how Peru is one of those countries it's like a sleeping giant, right? This is the former seat of the Inca Empire. It should be like in the G20 or whatever, and actually a country that doesn't have such a stratified society between rich and poor, between indigenous and, I don't know, Spaniard descended, whatever we want to call it, right? Criollo, whatever word we want to use. So it's that message truly it was clear to me, at least, that message resonated to the average Peruvian. So that the dynamics in Lima are unique in that, once again, Lima is also a pro-Keiko stronghold. Keiko dominated in Lima. So it was still fascinating to see how many average people still supported Castillo despite all of that in Lima.
No, it is absolutely fascinating. And I want to ask you in a moment about your experience and the relationships that you're able to foster like through DSA in that part of the world. But before I get to that, I just want to take another opportunity to ask you to sort of explain the gist of Pedro Castillo's campaign, policy-wise, what it represented. And I'd really like if you could talk a little bit about the coalitions that were brought into power because I know you and I have chatted a little bit about this privately, but it was amazing how almost immediately the story about Pedro Castillo in a lot of American left circles was, this is some kind of red-brown alliance, right, with this like horrible social conservative monster, and that wasn't the coalition that was being built. It was actually a really inspiring coalition that was bringing people who weren't very much represented by the political process before, and had a very strong working class message, and brought in a lot of the left organizations, the left parties. Anyways, you're the one who went there and talked to all the folks and saw things on the ground. So please tell me what you saw.
Oh my goodness, so much to unpack there. And yes, the very, very important questions to touch upon here. So I think something that's so critical to point out, there's a couple things that are critical to point out here. Every feminist group we met with, every group we met from the gay community in Peru, they were all firmly supporting Pedro Castillo. Mm-hmm. Out of the two candidates, Pedro Castillo and Keiko Fujimori, only one of them met with members of the gay community, and it wasn't Keiko Fujimori, right? Keiko comes from the far right, from the evangelical far right, right? So my position is, us, especially us leftists in the United States, rather than talk over the gay community in Peru or talk over the feminist community in Peru, let's listen to them. If we are troubled by some of the things Pedro Castillo said in the past, let's listen to what the Peruvians who are actually going to live under his administration are saying, right? Let's see what their opinions are, right? And they were firmly behind Pedro Castillo. DSA's longest running historical partner in Peru is the party Nuevo Peru, right? Mm-hmm. Which is their politics are almost to a T the same as DSA, right? I would say, Democratic Socialist. This is a feminist party. Once again, this is a pro-LGBTQ plus party in Peru. Every single one of them firmly backing Castillo. There was a news story a couple weeks before the election where Pedro Castillo worked out a deal with Veronica Mendoza, the leader of the Nuevo Peru party, saying, hey, we're going to, get better on social issues, and we can collaborate with, let's work together. The priority is a new constitution, right? A constitution made by and for Peruvians, right? And this was a message that resonated with a lot of people in Peru. So I think it's critical to point that out. I think it's also critical to point out once again how this coalition, every single aspect of it mattered, right? Mm-hmm. Just look at that vote total. What did he win by? 50.2%. Like, we even met with some of the smaller parties, right? The Partido Comunista Patria Roja, right? Literally the party that was founded by the Peruvian Marxist Jose Carlos Mariátegui, right? The Communist Party of Peru. Even those small parties, if literally just one of them peeled off of this coalition, he probably wouldn't have won. So this truly it's such a remarkable story to see this candidate who basically came out of nowhere, be able to forge, to have a message that was able to resonate so deeply to so many Peruvians that the entire left and entire progressive forces were able to come together in this movement to get this guy elected. And, David, you asked me a little bit kind of about Pedro Castillo's politics himself or whatever. I think another important point to make here, and perhaps this might be, my own opinion here, just from my interactions. I did get a chance to meet with Pedro Castillo as well, which was a very interesting experience. I don't know that this is a guy who's particularly motivated by ideology, to be completely honest, right? I see a lot of people trying to put different labels on him, whether it be negative labels like machista, whether it be people on the left saying, this is a guy who's coming from, who's a Marxist-Leninist. Mm-hmm. His party is certainly kind of like Marxist-Leninist, but he himself, I don't know that I would say that about him, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know that this is a guy that's motivated by ideology. I think this is a guy who came from the teachers union movement, who looks around in his community and says, why the hell is everybody so poor, right, in a country that has so many resources, right? I think this is a person who truly is an organic reflection of the massive upheaval that just happened in Peru last year, right? Mm-hmm. I think, and I tie this to one of the biggest lessons that I draw for the left here in the United States from Peru, which is Pedro Castillo and Peru Libre. They were able to tap into that anger that manifested itself in protests that happened worldwide, right? I don't know. In fact, I'd say it's pretty clear to say that the left of the United States was not able to do that to the extent, at least, that happened in Peru, right? The massive protests that happened after the killing of George Floyd, right? Nationwide, right? The left in the United States was not able to properly, to tap into that anger in ways that I saw happen in Peru, right? Because Peru simultaneously had a massive protest upheaval where they went through 3 presidents in the span of a year, which was insane in and of itself. But Pedro Castillo was able to tap into that, right, with his campaign platform. And once again, it was so amazing to see a community, a leftist movement, which has, God, you'd be hard pressed to find a left in this hemisphere that has been through as much as the Peruvian left has in the last few decades, right? That's probably an understatement, right? So it's just so amazing to see these people who have struggled for so long get this moment, right? And which is why it's so important to be pushing back against all this coup BS that's coming from the right wing. It's a desperate attempt from Keiko Fujimori to stay out of prison, which, sorry, Keiko, you're going back to prison. And yes, I'm an abolitionist, but it will be funny to see her go back to prison. Maybe that's been spirited. I don't know.
I'm down with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.